Welcome to another video for our LCA section. The topic of today's video is going to be something that might not sound very exciting, but I think it's really interesting. It's one of my favorite topics, and it involves a skill that is increasingly important for attorneys to have some basic mastery of, and that's document design. How to put together an attractive document when it comes to documents that you're going to submit to law-trained readers, such as attorneys in your law office or judges, such as a brief you might be filing in court. And I apologize for the email pop-up. Let me close that email out so we can start the PowerPoint here. So let's first of all talk about what it is we're talking about. We're talking about, in more technical terms, the concept of typography. So when I talk about document design and typography, I'm talking about the same thing. But in a nutshell, typography is the process of arranging the text and the type in a document so the document's readable and pleasing to the eye. In other words, making your document as readable as you possibly can and making it as pretty as you can make it. So I've already mentioned that typography, document design is increasingly important for attorneys to know how to effectively do. Why is that? Well, there are four reasons, I think, for this. One is that the first reason is that your readers, so law-trained readers, judges and other attorneys primarily, are very busy people. They're pressed for time. This is something we've talked about in other contexts of legal writing when we talk about how to write to your audience. So because these readers are busy, they want documents that are easy to read, documents they can read quickly and without much effort. So a well-designed document, very simply, is easy to read. Reason number two that you should have some basic knowledge of good typography principles is that a law-trained reader has a limited attention span. And at a certain point, if a document's not easy to read, your reader's just going to give up and put it aside. So you want to try to prevent that from happening. Documents that are well-designed are engaging because they hold the reader's attention. So that's reason number two. Number three, if your reader's a judge, the judge is going to expect to be persuaded by the document that you are submitting to the judge. Well-designed documents are more persuasive than documents that aren't well-designed because they don't frustrate the judge. They ideally will put the judge in a good mood, as weird as that may sound. And a judge who's in a good mood is going to be more receptive to what you're saying in the substance of the document. And then finally, the last reason, the fourth reason here why typography is important is because these days more and more judges read documents on screen than they do in printed type. So, and that's because many courts now require court filings to be submitted electronically. And that's true in Indiana. In whichever court in Indiana you're going to be filing documents, you're going to have to file them electronically. So there are certain characteristics of people who read stuff on screen that are different from people who are reading stuff in text that we'll talk about and talk about how you can design your document to be tailored to screen readers. So here's what we're going to talk about when we talk about typography principles. We're going to talk about the concepts of font, spacing, and medium. And the advice that I'm about to give as to how to handle these facets of typography comes with a warning, and that's that when you're filing documents in court, you first always have to check to see what the court rules say, because some court rules require certain formats for documents. If the court rules format requirements conflict with the advice that I'm giving, then you're going to have to follow what the court rules say. Now, fortunately, courts are getting better about amending their court rules to focus on good typography principles. But there are still some times when court rules don't follow those principles. So just be careful of that. But first of all, we're going to talk about good font practices. And when I say font, the term, I mean, you're familiar with this term. You're thinking of, well, what's the particular type of letter design that I am going to use in my document? And that, on a basic level, is what we mean by font. It refers to the design and the appearance of the letters that are used in the document's text. So what can you do with your font that makes the document easy to read? Well, the first thing you can do is you should use a proportional font rather than a monospaced font. So I need to define these terms. A proportional font is a font that that has letters that are of different widths. So, for example, skinny letters like I are narrow, and wider letters like W are wider. In other words, the skinny letters are skinny, the wider letters are wide. With a monospaced font, in contrast, all letters are the same width, regardless of whether it's an I or a W or an M or an O or an A or whatever the letter is. Monospaced fonts, such as Courier, are based on old typewriter fonts, okay? And proportional fonts are easier to read, plain and simple, because the reader's eye is able to travel across the document faster when reading a proportional font than it is when you read a monospaced font. So use a proportional font. Don't use one of those fonts that look like old typewriter font. Second principle has to do with serif fonts and sans serif fonts. So again, I need to define these terms. A serif font is a font that has little strokes appearing at the end of the lines making up the letters. So there are two examples in this slide. The font on the top is a serif font. That font, by the way, is Century Schoolbook. It's one of the really good fonts for using in legal documents. But you notice, for example, like the letter F has a little squiggly at the end of it at the top. It's got little strokes appearing at the base of the F that jut out from the vertical line. In contrast, sans serif fonts are fonts that don't have those little squiggly strokes at the ends of letters. So the font that's used at the bottom of the slide, that's Helvetica. That's a classic sans serif font. Serif fonts in print, and according to some neuroscientists that study reading on screen, serif fonts are easier for the reader to read because the letters are more distinctive than they are in sans serif fonts. So for extended blocks of text, most typography experts recommend that you use a serif font, particularly if you are submitting a document to a reader in print rather than electronically. However, even in that type of document, you can reserve sans serif fonts for headings in that document. So that your text, your extended text can be in a serif font, but your headings, to set off the headings, can be in a sans serif font. Now, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. I think some readers kind of think that that ends up looking like a ransom note where you have different kinds of letters. That doesn't bother me so much, and I think most readers, in fact, if you look at your textbooks, you'll probably see some examples where the text, the main text of the textbook is in a serif font, and then the headings in the text, in the book, are in sans serif fonts. Something to consider for documents that you think your reader is going to read on screen is that some studies have shown that documents on screen are easier to read when they're in a sans serif font. If you want to be really safe, though, I would stick with a serif font for extended blocks of text. So that leads to the next point, and that's with regard to what sorts of fonts are preferable. In other words, what is going to be most attractive to a reader and distinctive to a reader? When I refer to system fonts, I'm referring to fonts that are available for free through your word processing application. Okay, I'm not referring to fonts that you have to purchase, and there are in fact fonts that are out there that you can purchase to add to your word processing application. information. These are fonts, system fonts, that you don't have to purchase, that should already, most of these fonts should already be available, for example, through Microsoft Word or Apple Pages. So the A-list fonts I've listed here are fonts that typography experts, particularly a guy named Matthew Butterick, who's written a book, a really good book called Typography for Lawyers, that's specifically geared toward lawyers and writing documents to law-trained readers. These are some A-list system fonts that he recommends on the left-hand side of the slide here. For serif fonts, I particularly like Century Schoolbook. It's designed, that's a font that's designed for books. The documents you're going to be submitting are on pages that are essentially, the lines are going to be the length of lines you'd see in books, or approximate the length of lines you'd see in books. So those A-list fonts are fonts to consider using in your documents. Fonts to consider avoiding are on the right-hand side of the screen. Not necessarily because they're bad fonts, but because they're frequently used and thus are not as distinctive. So you see Arial a lot. Calibri and Cambria at one point in time have been default fonts. In other words, the font that immediately pops up when you open a document in Microsoft Word. So they're not bad fonts, they're just used a lot. I mean, I see Calibri all the time. As far as Times New Roman is concerned, that used to be a default font for Microsoft Word. The problem with Times New Roman is it's designed for reading in narrow columns of text, such as newspapers and magazines. And the documents you're going to be filing in court don't have narrow column widths like that. So Times New Roman, which tends to be a smaller and narrower font, is more difficult to read in longer lines of text. So next point has to do with point size. Point size, when we talk about fonts, has to do with how tall the font is. In other words, the vertical size of the font. And most typographers say that if you use a font that's smaller than 10 point or larger than 14 point, the text becomes more difficult to read. I recommend using between 11 point and 13 point because I think that walks a better line between having font that's too small and font that's too big. Now, one thing you have to think about, though, when you're choosing a font size for your text is the concept of X height. Okay, X height refers to the vertical size of a font based on the height of the font's lowercase x. All right, now this is a little confusing, and it's a bit weird, but some fonts that are of the same point size have different X heights. So even though two fonts may be, say, 12-point fonts, you may, as you compare them, see that the one font looks smaller than the other, even though they're both 12-point fonts. And that's because the one font's X height is smaller than the other font's X height. So for example, Garamond is a pretty common font that has a small X height. By contrast, there's a font called Book Antiqua. There's also Century Schoolbook that has an X height that's larger than Garamond's X height. So when you're choosing point sizes for your font, keep in mind that if you're using a font that has a smaller X height, you probably want to use a point size that's a bit larger. And by contrast, if you're using a font that has a larger X height, you want to use a point size that's a little bit smaller. The only way to really gauge whether a font has a small X height or a large X height is if you have to type them out on the page and compare one font to another. That can be a pain. But that's really the only way you can do it. You have to eyeball it. Next point is to avoid using all capitals for extended passages of text. That's because all caps are harder to read than text that varies capitals with lowercase letters. And that's because lowercase letters are more distinctive in shape than capital letters are. So it's easier for the reader's eye to recognize the distinction between those letter shapes, and thus the reader's going to be able to read the text more quickly. So don't use all caps for extended passages. They're okay for like short headings, but in your main text, I would recommend never using all caps. Next point is avoiding underlining. and substituting bold or italics instead. And this is, for example, if you want to emphasize in something in text, or you want to set off a heading from the main text. If you want to do that, I would recommend, I think bold is the best option. Bold font is the best option rather than underline. And again, this is because underlined text is harder to read. It slows the reader down versus bold text or italics, which is easier to read. And when you're comparing bold to italics, bold is actually easier to read than italics. So that's why I recommend that if you're going to choose between bold or italics, I would go with bold. I think this is a good pause point if you want to pause the video and take a breather, since we've been talking for a little while. So why don't you go ahead and do that if you want to do that. If not, you're welcome to just go ahead and forge along with me. Okay, so next document design typography principle we're going to talk about is spacing. So we're going to talk about horizontal spacing and vertical spacing of text. And what we're talking about when we talk about spacing is achieving a good balance between the document's text and its white space. In other words, the parts of the document where there are no text. The more you can achieve a good balance, the more readable your document is going to be. So first, we're going to focus on horizontal spacing. And when we talk about horizontal spacing, we're talking about two different but related concepts. One is how much space are you putting between letters and between words in the text? And second, how much horizontal space are you putting between the text itself as a block and the edge of the document's page? In other words, the margins. So first, spacing principle with horizontal spacing is, and this is actually probably easier for you as someone who's probably a millennial generation student versus somebody like me who's a Gen Xer or a boomer generation person who learned to type on a typewriter. I learned to type on a typewriter. Most boomers learn to type on a typewriter. You may have learned to type on a typewriter, but you probably learned how to type if you learned how to type taking a keyboarding class using a keyboard attached to a computer terminal. So the convention in professional typography, and it's one that you should use, is space once after any punctuation, including periods. And what happens tends to happen is a lot of readers, particularly older readers, tend to get hung up on this because they, like I did when they took a typewriter class, learned to space twice after a period rather than once. The problem with this is that a lot of reading studies have shown that when you space when you space twice after a period, you create gaps in the text, more noticeable gaps, which causes your eye to pause. So your reading your eye movement through the document's interrupted. It also creates these sort of conspicuous rivers, so to speak, of space in the text that is kind of disruptive. This two-space convention is based on using typewriters to type. Well, we don't use typewriters to type anymore. So my recommendation is type once after periods rather than twice. Don't look old-fashioned. It's not a huge deal, by the way, because most of your readers are going to be boomers or Gen Xers. But the convention, as I said, is one space. It's what's used in books and magazines and websites. And as you've read, you've probably never noticed there was only one space. So use one space because that's what professionals do and it's easier to read. All right, text alignment. That's the next horizontal spacing principle we're going to talk about here. When we talk about text alignment, that has to do with whether the left and the right edges of the text are either flush with the margin or not. So my recommendation is your text should be left aligned only. In other words, the left side of the text only should be flush with the margin, not the right side. The right side should have what's called ragged, be ragged. And that's kind of the non-fancy term for the right side. It's called ragged because the right side of the text will vary in length. parts of the left side of the or right side of the text will be flush with the margin and parts won't. Don't justify your text. Justified text is where both the left and the right margins are flush with the text. What happens when you justify text is that to make both the left and the right margins flush, your word processing application adds space between words. So you notice the two examples here in the slide. The left aligned passage, which is the first passage at the top left-hand part of the text, has a ragged right side, okay? There are no extra spaces between the words because of that. But the example at the top right part of the slide is justified text. You notice the difference there. There are extra spaces between the words. That slows down the reading speed. As far as centering text is concerned, I would recommend that you center text only for short headings, such as section headings in a document or a brief. You know, like your section headings for your question presented and your statement of facts and your argument in your conclusion sections. That's because it takes the reader a little longer to read centered text because their eye has to travel across the screen farther to get to the text. All right, and then we're going to talk about the last horizontal spacing convention or concept, and that's margins. Okay, so this is the amount of space between the text and the edge of the page. And here's my advice. Shorter lines of text are better. And that's because it takes the reader less time to read each line and then for their eyes to make the transition from the end of one line to the beginning of the next line. When you file documents in court or when you submit documents to a law-trained reader, most of the time you're going to be submitting documents where the pages are going to be 8.5 by 11 inches in size. Okay, these page sizes are more like the page sizes you see in books than the text columns that you'll see in newspapers or magazines, which are much narrower. So my advice is try to use larger margins so that your line length is smaller and thus your reader's going to be able to read more quickly. Now, this is going to create more pages in your document. So if you have to submit a document in hard copy, that's going to create more paper. So if you're trying to be environmentally conscious, maybe you use smaller margins in a document you know that your reader's going to print out. So maybe in that instance, you use 1-inch margins or margins that are 1.25 inches. But if you're going to be submitting a document electronically and you know your reader's going to be reading a digital document, I would go with 1.5-inch margins, which creates larger margins, more white space, shorter lines, easier to read. Now let's focus on vertical spacing. So vertical spacing has to do with the amount of space between lines of text. Studies of reading speed show that the optimal vertical line spacing, in other words, the amount of space between lines is slightly larger than single spacing. In other words, between like a single spacing and about a 1.25 line spacing. The paragraph on the left here in the slide uses 1.1 line spacing, and that is actually an option you can use in Microsoft Word. Okay, so if you're filing a document in court and the court rules don't require double spacing, or you're submitting a document to a reader who's not requiring you to use double spacing, I would use line spacing, vertical line spacing that's somewhere between single spaced and 1.25 line spacing. Microsoft Word is pretty limited. It gives you the option of using either single spacing, 1.1 spacing, line spacing, 1.5 line spacing, and double spacing. So I, in that instance, would go with 1.1 line spacing. And the reason for making this recommendation is because it's just faster to read lines that are in that spacing versus double spacing, where your eye has to travel farther between the end of one line and the beginning of the next line of text. And that's just because there's more space between the lines. All right, let's do another pause point here. Again, if you want to take a little bit of break, let your brain rest, maybe go off and do other stuff, and then you can come back and resume the video. Okay, last thing we're going to talk about, last document design principle we're going to talk about has to do with additional things you might want to include in your document if you are submitting the document electronically and you have a pretty good idea that your reader is going to read the document on a computer screen or a tablet screen or maybe even a phone screen versus reading it on a printed hard copy. All right. These recommendations are based upon the fact that we read stuff differently on screen than we do on paper. In the class session where I talked about formatting email memos and emails as a lawyer, we touched on this. And the principle is this: readers are more likely to skim text that's on screen than they are to skim text that's in a printed hard copy document. It's just the way our brains work. So what we do is we engage in what's called F-pattern reading. If you were going to do like a heat map that would track the movement of the eyes of a reader as they read something in a document on screen, it looks like a capital F, because screen readers tend to pay the most attention at the top of the screen, the text at the top of the screen, and at the left-hand side of the screen. And then as they go down and scroll through the document, they give less attention to the lines as they go along. And that's because they're skimming. So screen readers are looking for cues when they're reading a screen document about what's important in the document. So that's why the first recommendation I make is that you make headings a key feature of your document if you know your reader is going to be reading it on screen, because the headings give the reader cues as to what's coming up in that section of the document. So they give the reader an idea. In other words, they allow for easier skimming. They give the reader a concept of what they need to focus on if they're looking for the most important stuff. But they also give the reader cues about what the document contains content-wise, which makes for easier skimming of the document. Second recommendation is that you use left-aligned headings, because as I mentioned, screen readers tend to pay more attention to the left-hand side of the document on screen. So the more, if the headings are left-aligned, that means the reader is going to be able to more easily focus on those headings and thus more easily read the document. Third recommendation is for extended headings in a document, particularly, say, for example, point headings in a discussion section of a memo or the argument section of the document. You use what's called scientific enumeration. And it's called scientific enumeration because it's the type of labeling of headings that scientists use in documents they write to peers and to other readers in their fields. So I've given you a couple of examples here of traditional enumeration and scientific enumeration. So traditional enumeration focuses on the type of outlining, numbering, and lettering that you typically see in legal documents. So your main heading, for example, would start with a capital Roman numeral 1. And then your subheadings would go with capital A, B, C, etc. to label the subheadings. So the left-hand side of the example is an example of that. That indicates to you that, heading number Roman numeral 1 discusses the main point of the argument, and that subheading A discusses the first subpoint, and subheading B discusses the second subpoint. But the problem this creates for screen readers is that when you're reading something on screen and you're scrolling through the document, it essentially looks like one long page. So it's easier for the reader to lose track of where they are in the document than it is where you have a hard copy, where you've got physical cues, or you can figure out where you're on the document. You can tell when you're on page 5 or page 10 because you have the physical pages right there in front of you. So therefore, it's harder for the reader to keep track of where they are in a document if your headings use the traditional enumeration. You know, they run across an A subheading, for example, and they may wonder, well, is this subheading A of section Roman numeral 1 of the document, or is it subheading A of section Roman numeral 2 of the document? I don't remember. So scientific enumeration creates a situation where it's easier for the reader to keep track of where they are in the document because the headings are fashioned in a way that tell the reader what part of the document the subheading is part of. So you see the example of scientific enumeration in the right-hand example here, where you have your main heading, which is 1. First subheading is 1.1. Second subheading is 1.2. If you had a next main heading that was 2, it would follow the same format. The first subheading would be 2.1. The next subheading of section 2 would be 2.2. So if a reader is scrolling through an electronic document with this system and they run across subheading 1.1, they know that they're in the first subsection of section 1 of the document. So it's easier for the reader to keep track of where they are. Final recommendation for electronic documents, and then we're going to be done, is for you to use numbered or bulleted lists in a document, especially when you're discussing a rule or a series of, you're giving a preview of a series of points you're going to make in a document. Because this catches the reader's eye. Remember, a reader who's reading stuff on screen is going to be looking for cues in the document about what's most important. If they run across a list, that's going to catch their eye. That's going to tell you, I need to pay attention to this stuff. And it's also going to allow them to more easily sort through the items on the list. So here's an example of what you might do if you were stating a rule. So this is the the 3-element rule of Indiana's rule about negligence. And you see the 3 elements of negligence are listed in a numbered list rather than just run together in the text. This gives the reader a better idea, an easier concept of what is in the rule. So that is all for this presentation. I hope you found it helpful. And we are going to stop right there and back out of this slideshow.